Out of every 5 B-29 crewmen captured by Japanese forces, only 3 lived long enough to see liberation. For those who did, freedom didn't come after months of hardship. It came after days of agony that tested every limit of the human spirit. They faced execution rates higher than any other Allied prisoners, and their suffering violated every law ever written about warfare. What happened to them defied imagination, and their fate was sealed the moment they fell from the sky. When people think of the air war over Japan, they picture glittering formations of silver bombers cruising above the clouds, dropping their payloads, then returning home to victory. But for hundreds of B-29 crews, the story ended in smoke, fire, and a parachute descent into a world that would show no mercy. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress was the pinnacle of wartime engineering, capable of flying more than 3,000 miles with over 10 tons of bombs. From late 1944 onward, these giants lifted off from the Mariana Saipan, Tinian, and Guam for 16-hour missions into the heart of Japan. Their goal: cripple the empire's industrial might and force surrender without a bloody invasion of its home islands. But each man aboard knew the truth: if their plane went down, there would be no rescue. They were hundreds of miles behind enemy lines, surrounded by a nation that had seen its cities reduced to ash. Every Japanese soldier and civilian knew what those bombers represented. Each explosion that tore through a factory or neighborhood came from the bellies of the B-29s, and the rage that followed would soon fall upon any airman unlucky enough to survive the crash. By early 1945, American firebombing raids were turning entire Japanese cities into infernos. The attack on Tokyo the night of March 9th to 10th killed more people than either atomic bomb would later that year. Roughly 100,000 civilians in a single night. Over 15 square miles of the capital burned to the ground. The Japanese government recognized that these raids were crushing the nation's will to fight. But to them, they were also acts of barbaric terror. That belief would prove fatal for every captured crewman, because to the Japanese High Command, these airmen weren't soldiers, they were murderers. On August 13, 1942, Tokyo enacted a decree that changed everything: the Enemy Airmen's Act. It declared that any Allied flyer participating in raids over Japanese-held territory was not a prisoner of war, but a war criminal. These men, the government insisted, had forfeited all protection under the Geneva Convention. They could be executed for the so-called indiscriminate bombing of civilians. From that moment on, any B-29 crew that went down over Japan was as good as dead. American intelligence learned of the law, but misjudged its danger. Washington believed it would be used for propaganda, a handful of show trials, perhaps a few executions. What followed was far worse. Between 1944 and 1945, roughly 570 American airmen were captured in Japan or its occupied territories. Nearly all came from B-29 units. Less than 60% survived to see the war's end, a death rate of over 40%, even higher than the already horrific Allied POW fatality rate in Japanese camps, which stood near 27%. But statistics alone can't reveal the full scale of their torment. To understand that, you have to follow what happened the moment they landed, when the real nightmare began. When a B-29 went down, the crew's battle for survival began after the parachutes opened. Even before they touched the ground, enemy fire often found them. Japanese soldiers and even civilians took aim at the descending airmen, firing rifles, machine guns, and pistols at the helpless figures floating toward their fate. One man from the 462nd Bombardment Group was gunned down mid-air, his body riddled with bullets before his parachute even reached the ground. For those who landed alive, there was rarely a rescue, only rage. Entire towns, burned and broken by bombing raids, turned their fury upon the men they blamed for it all. Civilians armed with stones, sticks, and farm tools swarmed over captured Americans. Survivors recalled being beaten, stoned, and clubbed until unconscious. In some cases, there was no chance for surrender. Airmen were murdered on the spot by furious mobs before the military could intervene. The Japanese authorities did not stop the violence, they sanctioned it. For the Kempeitai, Japan's dreaded military police, every captured flyer was not a prisoner, but a criminal awaiting punishment. Once in their custody, the nightmare became methodical. The Kempeitai interrogation centers were places of horror disguised as offices. Inside, airmen were stripped, bound, and subjected to hours of beatings with heavy bamboo rods known as kendo sticks. Their bones cracked, but the torture was designed to keep them alive, to extract answers that many didn't even possess. Sleep deprivation became a weapon. Guards shook them awake every few minutes, refusing rest for days. Water torture followed, gallons forced into the stomach until the body swelled grotesquely. Then guards jumped on the abdomen to expel it violently. Electricity became another instrument of pain. Some prisoners were strapped to metal chairs wired directly to power lines. Others had hand-cranked generators attached to their flesh. Female prisoners were violated with live electrodes. Few remained conscious for long, but none were shown mercy. The cruel irony was that most of these men had no intelligence worth torturing them for. They were mechanics, gunners, and flight engineers, not strategists. The interrogators wanted secret targets, new weapon details, future plans, information these men simply didn't have. When they told the truth, they were beaten for lying. When they made up answers to survive, they were beaten for deceit. It was a loop of agony that never ended. Tokyo's central Kempeitai headquarters became infamous among the handful who lived to tell their stories. Prisoners were packed into former horse stalls barely 6 feet by 6 feet. Several men forced to crouch inside each cell. They received a handful of rice a day, if anything at all. The wounded were denied treatment, their open injuries used as new targets for beatings. Screams echoed through the halls daily, and the sounds alone were enough to destroy a man's sanity. Some were taken out of their cells for public exhibitions. A captured bombardier was tied to poles in a schoolyard, where soldiers practiced bayonet thrusts on his body until one pierced his throat. Another was paraded in downtown Tokyo, beaten, stoned, and kicked by civilians for hours until he collapsed. These displays served two purposes: to sat the public's thirst for vengeance, and to remind the nation that justice, in Japan's eyes, was being served. Then came the trials, if they could be called that. Under the Enemy Airmen's Act, these proceedings lasted less than an hour. There was no defense, no evidence, no appeals, only a verdict written before the prisoner even entered the room. Guilt was guaranteed. Death was the sentence. Once the verdict was spoken, the end came swiftly and brutally. Beheading was the preferred method of execution, a grim ceremony carried out with swords that often required more than one strike. In Osaka, B-29 crewmen endured failed executions. The first swing didn't sever their heads, and they were finished with pistol shots at point-blank range. Others were lined up before firing squads, or given lethal injections by prison doctors pretending to administer medical care. Between March and June of 1945 alone, 9 wounded airmen at Tokyo's Kempeitai headquarters were killed this way, not for crimes, but because they needed medicine the guards refused to waste. Even as Japan faced inevitable defeat, the killings did not stop. 11 captured Americans were executed at a rifle range in the summer of 1945. On August 15th, the very day Japan announced its surrender, 15 airmen were beheaded at Fukushima. Their deaths came after the war was already over. Official records confirm at least 132 Allied airmen were executed under the Enemy Airmen's Act, though the true number is far higher. As Allied forces advanced, the Japanese military burned documents, unearthed bodies, and cremated the evidence. Many families back home received only a telegram, missing in action. They would never know what truly happened. But not every death came from an executioner's sword. Hundreds of prisoners died slowly, from starvation, disease, and neglect. Rations were measured in handfuls of rice, rarely exceeding 600 calories a day. Men who once weighed over 200 pounds withered to less than 120. Dysentery, beriberi and diphtheria spread unchecked. The sick were left without treatment, and sometimes deliberately starved as punishment. At Fukuoka Medical School, the horror reached its peak. After a B-29 crash on May 5, 1945, 9 captured crewmen were delivered to the university's anatomy department. Over 3 weeks, they were used for vivisection experiments, conscious, unanesthetized, and helpless. Their organs were removed one by one in the name of science. All 9 died. The doctors responsible were later tried and convicted of war crimes, but no sentence could undo what they had done. Other witnesses described acts of cannibalism, prisoners executed, their flesh cooked and eaten by starving Japanese soldiers. In New Guinea and the Philippines, similar scenes unfolded, blurring the line between madness and ritual. For the survivors, these memories were so grotesque that many never spoke of them again. When Japan finally surrendered, Allied occupation forces uncovered evidence that defied belief. At war crimes tribunals in Yokohama, the survivors gave testimony so detailed and horrific that investigators struggled to comprehend it. Guards, officers, and doctors were tried and executed, but no punishment could match the suffering inflicted. Of the roughly 570 B-29 airmen captured, nearly 250 perished in captivity. That is a death rate unmatched by any other group of Allied prisoners. They were not merely victims of war, they were victims of a system that redefined humanity itself as expendable. For those who returned home, victory brought no peace. They carried the scars, visible and invisible, for the rest of their lives. Some testified at trials, others chose silence. Haunted by guilt for surviving when so many hadn't, families learned the truth years later through court transcripts and declassified files. The joy of liberation was shadowed by the unbearable knowledge of how their sons, brothers, and fathers had died. Today, few remember the story of the B-29 prisoners. Their suffering lies buried beneath the grand narratives of the Pacific War, the battles, the bombings, the surrender. Yet their story deserves to be told, not as an afterthought, but as a warning, because what happened to them wasn't just the collapse of humanity in wartime. It was proof of how far cruelty can go when law, mercy, and conscience are abandoned. They flew into the fire believing they were striking for peace. Instead, they fell into the darkest chapter of human history, one written not in days or months, but in moments of unimaginable pain, and for too many, those moments never ended.